Welcome to the Enneagram Global Summit, where top experts are sharing key insights that illuminate the 9 essential pathways to your true nature. Share this event with your friends and family, and come join us on Facebook at the Shift Network. And now your host, Jessica Dibb, founder of the Inspiration Consciousness School.
Welcome to the Enneagram Global Summit, 9 essential pathways for transformation. In this really groundbreaking session, we're going to be talking about waking up, involution and evolution in community. Our faculty is Reverend Nhien. Reverend Nhien is an accredited professional with the IEA who is passionate about furthering personal growth and spiritual evolution through cultivating Enneagram literate spiritual communities. And she has a very interesting history of being a Stanford lawyer that turned to being a unity minister. Nhien, we're so happy that you're here with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet, Jessica. I'm so excited to be here today with you.
Well, I think why we're excited is that we're all feeling, I think people of good heart, people who are awake and in their life, we all know that there is a radical shift in consciousness that needs to take place in our species. And we really need to be able to dissolve the barriers that we sort of create and perpetrate between ourselves and one another in interpersonal relationships and in cultural settings and all kinds of ways. And so we're all looking for ways that a radical shift in consciousness can affect social change and can create community, and that the power of that community starts to transform our culture. So I was so excited to find out about your work and what you're doing and how you're both able to, you're in that whole spectrum of community, the individual self, individuating and having spiritual awakening, and a kind of social activism. And I wonder if you could start out by telling us a little bit about yourself, in the sense that, you know, here you were a Stanford lawyer and, you know, working in a very prestigious place, and you chose volitionally to change your profession and to go into ministry, and then to use the Enneagram amongst other things for that ministry. Can you tell us about that choice and what has happened as a result?
Yes, well, definitely, you know, my outer life at the time was ideal, as most people from an outer framework would want it, meaning on the outside, I had what the world said you should have in order to be happy. And at the same time, I found that I was really hollow inside. And so I hit a kind of bottom in my life where I just felt a complete emptiness of being, even though on the outside I had all these trimmings, if you will. And notably, the bulk of my life, I had attempted to improve my life through a lot of self-help and personal growth work. But it wasn't until I hit this bottom in my life and started a spiritual journey did things begin to transform for me. And so I think, you know, reflecting back, the model that I teach and that I offer to within the Enneagram and spiritual framework is, it kind of really comes from my own experience of first seeking this through seeking my own wholeness and healing. So I was seeking healing for my individual self, but through the process of that, I came to, for the first time really in my life, feel a sense of belonging to the world, a sense of unity and oneness. And it was in that experience that I realized that, in a way, wholeness and oneness are interrelated. And that when we seek wholeness within, we come into the knowing of our connectedness with all beings. And it was from this direct experience that sort of that aha moment came in terms of wow, I've been looking for ways to serve the world my whole life. But it wasn't until I came upon the spiritual path that I realized this is actually what does it. It's not just psychology alone, but psychology, an understanding of psychology married to or coupled with this spiritual practice that would do it. And in that moment of like recognition, I had this, oh my goodness, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And that was my call to ministry, which happened in 2006. So it's been a while now. And so because of that direct experience of waking into a knowing not only of my own wholeness, but of my connectedness with all beings, I knew that I had to change what I did for a living and devote my entire life to this work.
So that was really a radical shift. And I know that you and I were talking in preparation for this, and you talked about how it was even really different for you culturally.
Yes. Yes. So I was born in Vietnam. I am a Vietnamese refugee. And when we arrived here to the US, my dad had about $15 in his pocket. And he and my entire family, my grandparents who lived with us, everyone scraped and sacrificed so that all of us children, there were 5 kids in my family, so we would have a good education. And so for me, the work that they put into so that I could end up at Stanford Law, was immense. And so culturally, it would have been most appropriate for me to stay in that job and give back to my family, if you will. So whereas pursuing a call to ministry might in other cultures or traditions be seen as a completely selfless act, for me, I had to deal with I had to address a lot of inner issues as well as interpersonal issues with my family around feeling like this was a most selfish act. To follow your passion rather than serve the needs of your family was really radical given the cultural upbringing that I had. So it took a lot of inner work to be able to first make that step for myself, and then continued inner work in order to heal and start to repair my relationship with my family that was sort of wounded as a result of this choice.
So that is such a powerful sharing, Nhien, because we actually all of the faculty are sharing for just a few minutes on each session something about our own journey with regards to the Enneagram when we found or discovered our point on the Enneagram map. How has that had an impact on us in a very personal way? So I wonder if you might say something about that in terms of the inner work that you said you needed to come to be able to do this, and then eventually the outer work that you had to do with your family to repair. Could you say something about how the Enneagram, knowing your type, assisted you in the inner work and the outer work?
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, I identify as a type 1 with a 2 wing, and as a sexual subtype. I do very much relate to the sense of stacking. So I consider myself sexual with a middle variant as social, with a blind spot as my self-preservation instinct. And I have to say that when I first realized that I was a type 1 on the Enneagram, I cried. I mean, finding out that at core, I never felt like I was good enough it explained everything that I had done my entire life up until that point. And it caused me to realize also how whatever happened in my family of origins, the struggles that we had, my whole pursuit of self-help books and all that was designed to figure out what's wrong with me. And I didn't realize there was nothing wrong with me, but that was part of the framework through which I was even inquiring, right? And so the healing that came from even that realization was a healing that caused me to say, this is about my own bias. This is about the lens through which I see the world, not necessarily how my family actually sees me. When the Enneagram caused me to sort of wake up to that, that was the beginning of tremendous healing, because then I could take responsibility for the ways in which I interpreted everything that happened in my family of origin to be about me not being good enough. And so when I could start that journey, then I was able to really look at my family from a more grounded and compassionate framework. I have to say, though, that that understanding my subtype and my family's, I would say, instinctual variant was probably even more revolutionary. I realized that growing up, probably every member of my family is a self-preservation instinct type. It caused me to realize that when I would drive home from law school, drive 6 hours to see my family and walk through the door, and my dad would not even look up to say hi to me, and no one in my family would actually ask me how I was doing, that used to hurt me so deeply. Later, when I came to understand that they are focused on self-preservation and the basics of the home, and that for their type, just having me in the house is what they wanted, and that me leaving home and being far away from the family when family was so important to them, both culturally and because of their instinctual variant. When I came to understand that, I came to understand the ways in which I was hurting them by not being close to home. But then I also came to understand, why is it that my family wants me at home? Dad would say, oh, when are you coming home? But when I got home, nobody would ask me how I was doing. Nobody in my family cared about that one-to-one interaction. They just wanted to sit next to me and watch TV together, you know? And it was hilarious. And then there's this beautiful story about ministry too, when I was like, oh, Dad is finally asking me about ministry after all these years. Everyone was like, yeah, what you're doing is so great. And no one in my family ever asked. My dad sat down one day and he asked, well, Nhien, are you going to be able to make a living doing that? And at first my heart was about to sink, going, oh no, that's all Dad cares about. But because of the Enneagram framework, I was like, oh my goodness, as a self-preservation type, my dad wants to know if I'm going to be okay. That's why he asked that question. Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. And because I didn't respond in a defended way, and I could see the love that came through in that question, you know, it's just moments like that and others that are very similar that have resulted in just immense heart opening for me around my family, being able to receive their love in a way I couldn't when I was younger. And so that's been profound, yes.
What a beautiful sharing. And I think it's emblematic of that, the Enneagram, as we become aware of these things, and then we have an appreciation for the diversity of being, you know, of ourselves and others, and we don't take it personally, and we have compassion, and we're able to kind of breathe and be with these things and let our neurology change in our bodies. We realize that everybody's expressing love in a different way, you know, and we all wanted it to be our way, but people are expressing love in the way that their instinctual variants and their type tends to do that. And I think it's one of the most profound things about the Enneagram.
Yeah. There was a quotation: communication does not begin with being understood. It begins with understanding others. And I remember hearing that and thinking, oh, the same goes for connection, to take it a little bit more deeply. And so, when I'd go home now, I would wash the dishes for my family. I didn't know. Before, to me, love is about connecting. And it's like for them, love is about washing the dishes, doing the household things. And so being able to give that love also, not just receive it, but give that love in a way that I didn't understand they needed before. It's just been so healing. Yeah.
Beautiful. So you've really specialized in realizing, and maybe partially it's from those experiences with your parents, but how doing psychospiritual work in community, doing it as a community-based approach, can really be a powerful lever for freeing yourself from contracted ways of being. I would love it if you'd speak more about a community-based approach to psychospiritual growth and the Enneagram.
Well, I feel very blessed that in a way I just sort of happened upon this model that seems to be, of all the work that I've witnessed in spiritual community, the most transformative, transformative in very speedy ways, process that I've seen happen for people. And what it involves is having folks gather together in small groups, probably no more than about 22 people. That's kind of the max I've noticed in groups before it becomes unwieldy, where outside the groups, we're studying the Enneagram. So I'll teach classes on the Enneagram, but inside the group, the focus is mainly on bearing witness to each other's journeys. And so in these group of Enneagram literate folks, we call them CPE groups, which stands for Contemplative Practices and the Enneagram. In these groups, what's happening is when we introduce ourselves, understanding that type is not the truth of being, we understand that, but as shorthand, we'll introduce ourselves by type, wing, and subtype stacking. So there's an educational piece to this when we say, hey, I'm Nhien, I'm a type 1, wing 2, sexual, social, self-pres. And, this week I experienced being criticized by my boss. And I recognized how my type got triggered in that. And I could also feel, however, how a new way of being is sort of emerging for me, where I could hold a ground of being, where I could feel my sense of enoughness and take the feedback for what it is, not something that cuts to my sense of worth, but I could feel how that was beginning to be triggered. At the same time, I could feel the solidity emerging within me that would enable me to hear that and take the feedback objectively. Or I might share in group something like, oh my gosh, I thought I'd grown so much, but this week I did my sermon, and afterwards, several people were complimenting me on it, but because I didn't think I did a good job, I went home and curled up in a corner on my couch and was sort of, painfully in type. And I and other people will share at sort of this level. I mean, in these groups, people share about suicide in their families, about incest, about sexual abuse, about depression and anxiety, about addiction. I mean, we share at like those depthful levels. And the amazing thing about what happens, because in these groups, we set forth safe sharing guidelines, if you will, which means that there are rules like no crosstalk, no unsolicited feedback. Occasionally people will ask the group, hey, I need some guidance, I'm open to feedback, but no unsolicited feedback. And no confidentiality. So all these guidelines are there in order to hold sacred space for the person who's expressing. And I don't think I could have predicted the healing and transformative nature of this space. So for the person sharing, being witnessed, when you share the muck and guck of being in your type, but being witnessed and simply presenced without having anyone give feedback has just created this space of love in which the moment of sharing becomes a moment of healing. That presencing shifts something for the person. But what another thing I didn't realize that's happening in these groups is that when we enforce gently and lovingly these guidelines, it supports not only the person sharing, but the person listening. You can imagine the type 2s in our group who are all eager to help and give their advice. But in these groups, I basically let them know that, basically what's happened, and then now I'm letting future groups know, what's happened is you have to stay in your own stuff. If you're not charged with helping the other people in the group, you have to sit with your own reaction. And so in our groups, if someone's crying and you're used to being the person who comforts and consoles, and you can't do that, you have to sit in the part of you that feels possibly impotent to fix or help, right? Or you just have to sit with how you're uncomfortable when others are uncomfortable. The 9s in our group that merge with others really experience, if someone's angry, they then merge with that energy and they have to sit with it. And then if they share it, they have to share only from what's going on for them. And so that forces people to deepen their self-awareness in a way that's been profound. So it's just been exciting to witness. And it's been educational for people, because there are folks, for instance, who come in and maybe they had issues with 8s. Well, I happen to have like 3 8s in one of my groups. And when people witness 8 sharing from their hearts, oh my goodness, the healing that happens for them around how they judge the 8s in their lives, it just changes. And so it's not just presencing, people are actually learning, because they are almost like witnessing on a daily or weekly basis Enneagram panels, right? People sharing directly from their experience about being their type. So everybody is not only being loved, but they're learning, and therefore having more compassion and empathy for the struggles that are both universal and the struggles that are particularly difficult for specific types. So it's just been this, wow, I never would have predicted the amount of growth that could happen in this space. These are some of the things I've been seeing.
So Nhien, it's so useful for people to hear these extremely practical ways that they can compassionately and objectively work with their type for true transformation, individuation, spiritual awakening. So you talked, for instance, about the 2 and the way that their personality can sabotage personal growth is to keep thinking that it's about the other's personal growth and spiritual unfoldment, and that not realizing that what's the real contribution would be themselves. So you give them the practice of just having to sit there and really be with whatever their beauty and whatever their discomfort is, so that they really are able to allow themselves to develop. And I think it would be wonderful to go around to each type and have you say something about how, from the perspective of psychospiritual growth, each type can sabotage their growth, and a specific spiritual practice that can help them loosen that grip of personality. And before we do that, I wonder if you could say about involution and evolution, because I think both of those in community, both of those will play a part in this transformation.
Yes. So involution from a unity perspective is the idea that this oneness that is that some call God or spirit or divine mind, some call just simply love or light, that oneness cannot experience itself. And so the idea behind our individual lives is that while oneness never actually changes, there's an illusion of separateness that is a necessary part of oneness being able to have an experience of itself. And so so there's an object and subject in this dream, if you will. And so involution from a unity perspective is one way of framing it in a personified way is God involves itself in man or humankind, meaning God or spirit becomes matter. And so it's as if spirit is slowing down and becoming first rock and grass, and then that life, as it becomes a thing, it slows down and goes into a more dreamlike state in which it forgets its identity as spirit. But as that solidified matter starts to increase in complexity, it moves toward what we call evolution. So spirit involves itself in humankind, becoming matter, and then matter waking up to its spiritual nature is what we call evolution. And what's beautiful about this process for me is when I first learned about waking up, it felt like everybody just wanted to escape this world. Like, let's just wake up to our oneness. But and for me, there was within that some implied, life is suffering, and so let's just go back to oneness. But I always wondered, but why did this even happen in the first place? I don't feel like life is a mistake. And so this concept of involution helped me to understand how becoming fully matter, fully embodied, is actually a beautiful part of the journey. And the suffering is only the result of us not having yet fully awakened or reawakened to the knowing of our true identity as spirit. For me, what Jesus did when he became awake is when we talk about spirit fully embodied or God fully embodied in Jesus, what we're talking about is all of us, which is this idea that spirit becomes fully embodied, but then wakes up to know essentially that the Father and I are one. And so the two processes for me are ideally happening simultaneously, so that my perfect life expression is me uniquely Nhien in the ways that only a one can be in this world, but an awake type one, fully awake to my God nature. And so in that, I shift from what Unity calls personality identification, from personality to individuality. And so that's my model for saying, like, hey, we're not mistakes. We're meant to be unique in exactly this way that spirit can express and experience itself only as me. But I suffer if I don't also know my universal nature, the ways in which I am the same as everyone else. If I know both, then I sit at the door, the Christ at that doorway where I'm able to, with my heart, perceive both oneness and duality at the same time. So
right. And that oneness and duality become non-dual in a certain sense, in the sense that you no longer experience them as opposite, but instead they both are generating something that is a powerful expression of self.
Yes.
And it's kind of like Carl Jung's expression or description of individuation.
Yeah.
I think of it sometimes, Nhien, I'm wondering if this resonates with you, that the source or the beloved or the divine the oneness, as you said, it's not only experiencing itself, but it's experiencing its capacity.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, and everything about that. I mean, it's, to me, it's radiant, it's beautiful, it's oneness learning like what it is, if you will, and yet in an infinitely expansive way, you know. And in terms of the need for this, we talked a little bit about that before this call, that to me, when we know that we are one at core, you know, to me, that's the remembrance of love that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin talked about, of like, love is the necessary force that will take us to this next level of being. When we come to this unified remembrance, you know, we don't become less individual, we become more and whole, and there's a holographic reality that gets to be experienced. And
beautiful. And I feel like this is, you know, these are concepts that the Enneagram can help us live out in an embodied way, because it shows us what we are not seeing about life, about reality, about ourselves, so that we free up all these powerful energies and unique expressions instead of keeping them trapped because we're trying to keep a particular fear-based structure in place.
Yes.
So you were talking about the 2, and I wonder if we could go around the Enneagram now, and you could say something about how you work with, in the community-based program in CPE, how you work with each type's capacity or predilection to sabotage its personal growth and spiritual awakening, and then a specific practice that you can give to each type to open to that spiritual awakening.
Yes. So I will say that I can't believe I didn't say this earlier, but it's so primary and so obvious to me that I almost forget that we do it. We do a 20-minute centering prayer sit in every gathering that we have. And so that's vital, because that's centering prayer. It has been called divine therapy. And it's a practice of spiritual surrender, where as we gather together, the idea is that we die to our egoic selves and are reborn in the silence by this intelligence and wisdom greater than our own. But that is also the essence of our being. And so to me, without that practice, all this, my advice and counsel, are of little use to folks. But with that practice, coupled with that practice, one of the things that when I look at type 1s, that can be very supportive for ones is to look at, number one, just like for me, the propensity for ones to want to fix themselves, like something's broken inside, that I'm not good enough, so this is the process of improving myself, rather than framing it as waking up to the realization that I am already whole. And in that, you know, ones can tend to, in groups, only share when they are very, like, have insight. They know that they have something wise and profound to say. And so often my invitation to the ones in the group is to raise your hand to speak before you know what you will say. And in the witnessing of their messiness, ones experience a deep healing. So before you've got it all together, just blurt it out. So that's been very profound. Of course, we mentioned 2s, but also reminding 2s to speak in I statements. I mean, there's that, you know, 2s will have a propensity to talk to you about everyone in their lives but themselves, and just remembering that, so that they can own this deep-seated shame around having needs. And recognizing for themselves that oftentimes for 2s, that admitting that they have a need brings up the shame of like, if I were truly lovable, that need would have already been met. I experienced that a lot for 2s. And for the 3s, there is definitely, I mean, first of all, just to get the 3 to the group is an amazing thing, and to get them to sit still for a while. So it's already self-selecting that a 3 that arrives in my group has a certain degree of spiritual awakening happening already. But definitely, not sharing from your resume, but sharing from your heart. Just remembering that maybe you don't want the group to necessarily know who you are in that outer world, so that something deeper can be revealed, if you will. And speaking in feeling statements can be so valuable for the 3. For the 4, there is so much. Well, first of all, what I see in our 4s is often this initial issue of belonging. My invitation to 4s that has supported them is, in our groups, we also do this thing where I say, you know what, a lot of times we come to group and we feel like we have to leave a part of ourselves at home. Like if we had a rough day, and I said, I always share with the groups that it's important for me to show up exactly as you are, and to be able to like share that with the group. And that invitation has kept 4s with enough of a sense of belonging to keep them coming in a way that supports them in finally breaking through the I don't belong, if you will. So for type 5s, it's funny how in a lot of groups we can support feelings by not sort of trying to fix them. But I found that in some of our groups for a while, I was answering too many questions, and I realized I was like, oh, I'm catering to the 5s, because they're allowed to ask questions, and really recognizing that I will push back now when any of the head types really start asking like questions to know the Enneagram more, and actually helping them to sit in not fully knowing and understanding, and being willing to sort of stay with that. And so that pushes through the 5s need to know in order to be okay. And that has had a profound influence. I had couples in our group who've been married, they're in their like 80s and 70s. I have 2 couples who have been married for like 40 years or so. And both of the wives of these 5s were like, I have never heard so-and-so share in a group before in my life, like after all these years. And to share about the potential medical diagnosis, this is amazing. This is amazing. And so we're seeing profound things happening when we invite that, sort of, what if you didn't have to know? What if you could engage before knowing? So for the type 6s, first of all, I've experienced from our 6s a lot of healing from just going, oh my gosh, when I found out I was a 6, it helped me to not feel so messed up and crazy that my mind is so crazy all the time, and so for them, a lot of just sitting in groups with other 6s has helped them to feel like not so crazy in their heads, if you will. But similar to the 5s, what we can push is this invitation to trust what you know, and so not have to check in with the teacher so much, not have to sort of check in with the group to resist that. Does this make sense, everyone? The 6s always want to go like, does this make sense? And what do you guys all think? And to support as a group that person just speaking what they intuit has been very powerful in helping 6s to sort of trust their inner wisdom, if you will, and their connection to spirit in that way. For 7s, really, I often share in the beginning that for most of our 7s, chances are you're going to get bored with this right? And decide that a different method is going to be better for you. If that's been your pattern of like constantly seeking, oh no, this is not interesting anymore. Oh, this was most sevens come in and this is the coolest thing ever, right? And then for us to go, to give them the awareness that there's going to be a time when it feels boring. And if you could just show up and come anyway and sit through that, then sevens are forced to then address the fear that the inner terrain of consciousness is like a desert. And if you can sit through that, because we're aware of it and you're aware of it, and we can hold space for you in that, and that you can heal through that. And so we've had sevens who will face their depression. I mean, I've had a seven who finally in group for the first time, shared about a miscarriage. We're talking at that level of pain that has never been addressed, that gets to be able to be honored within the seven's own being and then witnessed in sacred space. So, but you have to really give explicit permission for that. And so for eights, oh goodness, I think for eights, I make a special effort to create space for to assert my power in the space, so that the eight doesn't feel that they need to, so they can rest in that space. So there's a container for it. But definitely, of course, the invitation for eights is to recognize the ways in which they want to cover up their vulnerability. And so making explicit space for any little thing, and very much affirming and recognizing that when the eight just says, oh, I'm not feeling okay, that's like the four, saying I've had a horrible, horrible day, and so creating space where we honor and understand that that's huge for an eight to even admit something that fair. So a lot of this is about how speaking into the space in the way that the type feels they have permission to reveal that shadow aspect of their type is invaluable. And when I go through after going through the final type, I'll also talk a little bit about the contemplative postures that we recommend. But for the nines, definitely the invitation to be seen, to engage is very strong for us. We honor and give permission for how, when the 9 moves toward 3, sometimes they overdo it. Like when nines will ramble on and on and on and on to be seen, but we give explicit permission for that space. So that's how the community holds a container, and how a leader of a group like this can hold a container. But I want to kind of speed through quickly to how our groups rely on the Sacred Enneagram by Christopher Heuertz as a basic textbook. And so that underlies all of our work, where we understand that for the 8s, 9s, and the 1s, which are body types, that the posture of stillness is invaluable. And so each of those types is encouraged during their week to incorporate that, like, maybe I don't have to go get stuff done right now, kind of thing. And then for the 2, 3, 4s, it's solitude, because for those image types, it's sort of like who am I when I'm not having myself reflected back. So the encouragement of going and doing solitary retreats and times like that. And then of course for the 5, 6, 7s, inner silence is what's recommended. And so this understanding that, it's not just about going into outer quiet, but of really recognizing the ways in which your mind engages in non-productive thinking, and sort of supporting more of like the feeling nature for those types and supporting them being in their bodies also. And so when these types recognize that, they go, oh, well, this is clearly the one that is most challenging for me. And so the invitation of our groups is always to practice in a way to develop spiritual practices in our everyday lives that are contrary to the habituated patterns of your particular type, as opposed to what most people do, which is, oh, I had a 7 start, and he's like, yeah, I belong to 5 yoga studios. I'm like, well, so, you know, the ways in which when we run our spiritual path on our own, our egoic structures often pick the thing that actually reinforces the type, right? Just like I'm a very active type and I like to do kickboxing, and someone's like, well, yeah, and you maybe could use some yin yoga, you know, like, oh, stillness and like where I'm not feeling productive. Oh, okay, I get it now. It's counter to the habituated pattern of my type, and therefore can help to offset its compulsive pull, if you will. So that's how, you know, that's just a really quick overview of how I would approach the various types and their propensities, if you will.
And it sounds like people are experiencing very powerful transformations. I noticed that you mentioned your title is Interspiritual Unity Minister. What does that mean?
Okay, for me, it means that while unity is both historically and culturally grounded in the teachings of Jesus, and I say teachings of as opposed to teachings about Jesus, that we and I actively embrace practices and principles from like the world's religious and spiritual traditions. And so within a group, I might do within my CPE group on Tuesdays, I often do a loving kindness meditation to get us into our heart space, for instance. And I'm very open to what the different world's traditions have to offer that can support people, and recognize that even depending on your Enneagram type, there are certain traditions that you might be more drawn to, and that create a portal for you to enter. But then also recognizing that sometimes those traditions you're drawn to because it actually supports your type. And so having some awareness around, you know, like how Buddhism feels very 5-ish, right? You know, in its orientation, and might be what 5s like to think about. But to actually use that as a portal for entry, and then maybe then invite them into maybe more Christian faith traditions that are heart-based. And so kind of having that toolbox, I can kind of invite people through something that feels accessible to their type. And then once they feel safe and secure, you know, have that degree of safety, I can borrow from a different tradition. So I feel very fluid and flexible. For me, I believe that the bulk of the world's traditions, when taken to a mystical level, you know, to me, it's what it points at, right? It's not necessarily the outer framework, but it's whatever is going to most support you in having the direct experience of your own wholeness, your perfection, and of your oneness with all of life. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And along with that, you do something called spiritual tutoring.
Yes.
And who can benefit from that? What does that involve?
Mm-hmm. Well, so what that involves is I usually incorporate the Enneagram. For some folks who come to me anew, then I will introduce the Enneagram to them. So we use an Enneagram framework as the base for, hey, how do we craft an individualized spiritual practice for you? Kind of similar to how I was addressing like the CPE groups, based on both your type and based on recognizing where your type is most likely to abandon spiritual practice. Again, so recognizing if I'm working with a 7, I'll put it at the front end that like I require a commitment, you know. If I'm working with a 1, I'm going to actually encourage lots of irresponsibility, if you will, play and things that feel irresponsible for one. So using the Enneagram to tailor, when I say a spiritual practice, I almost mean a life practice, like to really create a way of living that helps to offset type. And when I say that, I say that very carefully, in that I want to say that when I teach the Enneagram, I teach as many spiritual teachers teach it, from this framework that the circle of the Enneagram represents your wholeness, that we are all whole, that we're not any one type, that we're not trying to not be our type either. It's that for me, what spiritual work does is that it gives you access to whatever is the most skillful and appropriate response in the moment, even if it defies type. And so the idea is that to whatever extent I'm limited to this little framework that's like at the point 1-ish with a 2-ishness, that if in a moment breaking the rules is going to be the highest expression of myself, I don't want to be limited by my egoic framework and go, no, I can't break the rules. And so the idea behind this practice is not necessarily that I need to become a different type, but if I need to tap into 8ness, you know, like if that's the most loving and whole response in the moment and my type was keeping me from it, then this work is designed to give a sense of expansiveness and full freedom so that I can access all aspects of my humanity and my divinity to make the most powerful and wise act or choice in any given moment. So that's, to me, the goal of this work, not to not be your type, but to not be bound by the rigidity or compulsion of your particular point. Yeah.
Wonderful, Nhien. So can you share with people how they could be in touch with you if they'd like to learn more about CPE groups or spiritual tutoring, or just your whole orientation to community-based Enneagram spiritual growth?
Yes, well, my email is Nhien@unitytemple.com, and Nhien is Nhien. And right now, that is probably the best way to reach me. I'm in the process of creating an evolving Enneagram website. That's not quite up yet, but I do have a Facebook group called Evolving Enneagram. And so you can like that page and friend me on Facebook too. The spelling of my last name is Vuong. And once you hook up with me on Facebook, I can send you to all the right places for doing this work. And also, there are folks who have asked me to pilot CPEs in their community. And so if you are a spiritual leader, if you're a counselor, someone who just wants to hold space in conscious ways, so it's not just about your individual work, but creating these spaces for great transformation to happen in your communities, I can also support you through my spiritual tutoring sessions in helping to seed these groups in your community. So
thank you so much. So Nhien, we are speaking to many thousands of, tens of thousands of people around the globe in over 100 countries. And I know that they're all tuned in because they are looking for pathways for personal transformation and awakening and application into everything from business to their families. And I wonder if there's anything that you would like to share from your heart with everyone around the globe.
yes, well, what I often share in my groups is, for me, there's no amount of there are no amount of videos you can listen to, or books you can read, or teachers you can listen to, or understanding that you can have that to me are worthwhile to have without love and compassion. Because for me, this Enneagram knowledge without compassion could actually be more hurtful than helpful. And so my invitation is, as you delve into this powerful tool for transformation, that each step be completely woven with love and compassion. So as you learn about type, as you learn about others' types, and there's something about how just doing that with this tenderness and gentleness toward yourself can, in the moment, heal. Because I don't think the spiritual journey is necessarily linear. That in a moment of pure love, I think we have everything we need, if you will. And so that's my invitation, that if you don't remember anything from the session, that you remember like a profound compassion toward anything that you're viewing, whether it's you're looking at yourself in the mirror or you're looking at partnership or relationship through the lens of the Enneagram.
Nhien, it has been so inspirational for you to share in such a personal way how working with your own involution and evolution with the Enneagram inspired you to follow a path that was true to your soul and your heart and your mind and your body. And I want to really offer a bow of gratitude to you for that courage and blessings on your work, and want to acknowledge everyone that's listening for all the good work that you're doing around the globe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you for joining us for the Enneagram Global Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To add this powerful collection of teachings to your personal library, visit enneagramglobalsummit.com/upgrade. To join our global community of people awakening to their divine humanity and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for gathering with us and for sharing this empowering path with your friends and family.